Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the What the Research Says, Playful Lectures, How Games Can Help Learning webinar with Associate Professor Dr. Pijus Krūminas. My name is George Bergstrom, and I'm the Southwest Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the question moderator for today. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the American Library Association's Games and Gaming Roundtable. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few announcements. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. The session is 1 hour, so you'll receive 1 LEU for today. If you're watching the archived recording of this webinar, the instructions on how to obtain your LEU are available in the video's description on YouTube. Or you can also find the instructions on the ISL's continuing education site under the LEU policies. I'll now turn it over to Dr. Krūminas.
So thanks, George, and hello, everyone. I hope the sound is fine. And I'll start off by sharing my slides so that everything is settled. So yeah, thanks for inviting me and having me over here. Very glad to talk about what I do at the university in relation to games, and I'm very happy to see everyone joining. And feel free at any time, post questions, and I'll be happy to answer them, at least to the extent that I can. So today's structure for the webinar, I sort of picked 3 key points that I would like to discuss. So first of all, I'll focus on some background, local background and personal background on how I brought the games to classes and start using them. That sort of may help understand the possible pathways to inclusion of games or introduction of games into class, and making sure that they get accepted by the institution and the participants of classes. Then I'll talk a little bit about games from the perspective of experiential learning and where games stand in relation to the whole learning process. And third, I'll use some examples of games that I use in class and from what perspectives I use them, and also how asking students to work on their own games and develop their own game prototypes can also be helpful, not only in terms of learning to design a board game, but also to understand our reality, what is the human condition, so to say. So to start off with a short background story, so a bit about myself before I start talking about games, so that you get to know me better. So as George introduced, I'm currently an associate professor at ISM University of Management and Economics in Vilnius, Lithuania, and I have background in political science and in economics. So naturally, I teach in those fields, and my examples will likely more focus on those fields, as these are the key areas where I'm more engaged with using games as a teaching tool. So most of my work experience comes from teaching. I've been teaching for over 10 years, mostly game theory, but in that mathematical sense, where you have players trying to identify the best strategies instead of actually playing games. So the mathematical approach to strategizing and decision making. But I also teach wargaming and also comparative politics. I did policy consulting for quite some time, but I'm mostly in the academia. So looking at the classes where I use games specifically, so it's comparative politics, it's simulation development class that I have, which is basically a bit renamed Introduction to Wargaming, where students work on their own game models and develop their own prototypes by the end of the course. And then I also use some games in training for public institutions. I had some also experience at the military academy with that. Now, one more thing that I think is important to note, that I know that from country to country, this varies. And the classes that I have are usually divided into 2 consecutive parts of 90 minutes each. We sort of usually have 90 minutes for a more theory-focused lecture part, And then you have about 90 minutes for more practice-oriented or discussion-focused seminars, but it can be shifted. So if I want, I can basically run games for 3 full hours, 90 minutes plus 90 minutes with a short break in between. So just to give a bit of the context of the length and the flexibility that there is at my institution. I know others have it longer, others have it shorter. So just to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to this. So what I also think is important to mention is a bit about the local context. So I come from Lithuania. We regained independence in 1990, March 1990. So we'll soon have 34 years of independence. And this has implications for overall sort of society's view of the game and how the games are usually seen, because before the independence, so regaining independence before 1990, during the Soviet occupation, there was a lack of gaming subculture. So such subcultural groups were not positively looked at by the government institutions, and so it didn't really develop. So you had, of course, chess. Chess was maybe an exception, but you had chess. You had snakes and ladders kind of games, but basically for the more advanced games, like you already have in the Western countries in the second half of the 20th century, it still is not really existing. We can talk about pulp culture, which also doesn't fully reach here, even the music and so on. It's very limited in the sense of what we could have. And basically only in the 90s, early 90s, first it was Warhammer that came into town. That is Warhammer as in the miniature play, but also with the role-playing games, but mostly it was miniatures or tabletop role-playing games. I believe, Vampire the Masquerade was, for example, one of the more popular ones in the late 90s, early 2000s. So it's only emerged, like 30 years ago that these are being picked up, usually by very small groups of people related to local science fiction and fantasy conventions. It's still not in the sort of broader society out there. We have a proper board game shop, meaning which has more than Monopoly or the very classical games in Vilnius only in the early 2000s. And it's also in the early 2000s, you already start emergence of local games and growth in the board game as a part of the culture, which really picked up like some 5 to 8 years ago. Maybe we of course had these various replicas of Monopoly called the Manager and localized to reflect the local towns and local cities. But for a very long time, it's the games are seen as a very both childish activity, I would say, and they're not really easy to get if you talk about more advanced games or more unique games than the very, very standard ones that you could get also in the early 90s. So in this context, there is always a challenge of saying that you work with games as an educational tool, because the games are still quite often associated only with leisure activity, hobby, and something that's not really serious. So what got me on this pathway was reading Philip Sabin's book on simulating war. So as you know, the more serious application of board games has a close relation to the military history coming back from the 18th, 19th century. So I've been reading this book, which was focused on war games, so specific topic and specific ways to simulate war using board games as a medium. But what got my attention, especially because some of it was very technical and very applicable to the kinetic warfare, but maybe not to the subject that I was teaching at the time, was the inclusion of the author's Kartenspiel, so a card game based on Napoleonic warfare, which just used standard set of cards. And then it got me thinking, okay, so if you can use standard set of cards to simulate warfare, and quite a specific one in a specific period, in a specific place, maybe it could be possible to use something like that in the classroom. I've just started teaching comparative politics by the time, and I just started thinking, okay, so what can I do something like that? I didn't think of any commercial games to include yet, but some quick activity that I quickly, sort of cook up and introduce in the class to engage the student, to make sure that the students are more engaged, to learn maybe or internalize some of the topics that we cover better, and so on. And so the topic I've selected for that was on transitions to democracy. That is, what happens exactly when a country transitions from a dictatorship to a democracy. So certainly this has also, relevance looking at the national context and the national experience, but also it has interesting processes that relate to this transition. So for example, there is an information asymmetry. So dictatorship is a low information environment where neither the opposition nor the government fully know whom and to what extent the society and the population supports. Then it had an interesting concept of revolutionary cascade. So when people start joining the protests against the government, so for example, that's coming from a political scientist in Quran, that, the more people join, the more people are likely to join, because each of us has a certain threshold at which point we think that the protests are going large enough that it is worth joining and that they can achieve something. Other things that were important, and we discussed in the lecture part of the class, are the heterogeneity in the society, so different societal groups that can have similar or correlating interest in changing the government, but after that, this interest may well diverge. And this may lead also to within team competition. So is the opposition always that united? Well, very likely not. And same could be said about the government. So, okay, so we have quite a few topics. And the question I asked myself was, can I use a standard deck of cards, a single deck of cards of 52 cards, to try and model this? So the cards have certain advantages. Well, they're easy to get. So you can get, even if you have a larger class of 20 or 30 students, you can get the card decks easily and quite cheaply. Then, so you don't have a lot to invest in this sort of game infrastructure, in the physical components. The cards have the cards have numbers, so running from 2 to 10. So you can use them to build these revolutionary cascade when people start joining, showing the increasing size of the protest. Okay, so that's one thing that could be used. Can you use heterogeneity in a society? Likely, yes. First of all, you can separate the number cards and the face cards to have the some in the opposition and some in the government. Then within each group, you could have the suits to represent different interests. So for example, labor, you can have capital, you can have still other groups, religious groups, cultural groups, and so on, represented by different suits in the society. And then this could help also to show the competition that could emerge within teams. So that led to one page of rules, or a 1.5 page of rules for the game, just basically building a set of cards following the trend from 2 upwards to 10, while the government used their own cards to try to disrupt that. And students, when they started using this, and a disclaimer, it's not a good game. It's not a fun game in itself. I mean, it's good for the class. It would need a lot more work to be workable as a hobby game. But it worked in the class because it addressed the specific topics that we covered in the class. Information asymmetry. So you have a hand of cards, you don't show it to everyone. So others don't know or don't necessarily know what you have. You have these revolutionary cascades that we had as a modeling concept. You have the competition and so on. So, and students seem to be engaged with that. And that led me to exploring other means of using games or introducing games in the classes to help learn about social reality, mostly in the political and economic, politics and economics areas. And this led to extension of the use. So, for example, the political scientist Michael Laver has released, I think it was already in the 80s, a book of playing politics that sort of help allow players to, well, it's not really a fully maybe a board game. It has some role-playing elements to role-play different institutions and the working of different institutions, voting, committee decisions, and so on. And later on, we started developing games with students together, or rather, students started developing the games with a tiny bit support from me. And these are some examples from the last year, where students worked on topics such as nuclear race between the US and the USSR, and during the Cold War, then the First Ottoman War, or resource exploitation, and others. So where do games stand in the learning process? So first of all, I think what needs to be done is the separation of two concepts. So one is that is currently also sort of on the rise is gamification, as where activities are seen as games, and games as activities where games are a method of learning. So my focus here today is more on the latter, that is the method of learning rather than incentivizing preferred behavior so that you reward for some behavior as if it's in a game during the classroom. One more thing that I would like to know at once is that I focus on board games, so an analog rather than digital format, due to a couple of reasons. First of all, if students want to develop something of their own, it's easier without proper programming classes or other digital skills related classes to work on one and to prototype one. Most importantly, if you want to play a board game, you have to know the rules. If you have to know the rules, then you understand what arguments the game provides and what is the underlying model of the game. So how the relations between actors are represented, how their actions are represented, the resolutions and everything. So sort of, they usually, by the time I teach them, they already have had some classes related to social science models and social science methodology. So they can easily link those to the rule games with the models that we've covered before in other classes. And finally, of course, it's a social activity. So students can engage one with another. If, for example, they come from different groups, they can get to know each other. There are discussions of what's happening instead of just, playing through the screen, even if playing with other players. So I'm not saying that digital games are bad or couldn't be or shouldn't be used, but that's basically the reasons why I focus myself on analog rather than digital medium for introducing games in class. So where it comes back to, I think, is a Kolb's model of experiential learning. So it comes from Kolb 1984, where the author, the researcher, discusses the key elements of how learning through experience comes, where a participant, a learner, gets something concrete experience of the reality that they can then observe and reflect upon, leading to making a more abstract conceptualization, which allows them to experiment with that reality and get new concrete experience. So while the model itself is more general, it aligns very well with the use of games in the class. Because if we agree that games are sort of a simulated reality, then the student participating in a game gets that concrete experience through the game, through the way the rules work and through the way their actions are resolved, and students get feedback, which leads them to observe, okay, so I did something in the game, I got that experience, did I do well or did I not, and what can I do to make it better? So it asks the student to reflect so that they get closer to victory in the future turns, in the future rounds of the game. This also leads to them creating sort of an idealized view of the road to victory, or the road, or the path to winning the game, through abstracting these concepts of this single experience, trying to draw a more general lesson that they could use throughout the game and hopefully win. And finally, this leads to active experimentation. So if you now have a new theory of how the game works and what you need to do within the game, then you start experimenting, pursuing initially the actions that you expect to bring, the most benefit to you as a player, and these experiments lead to new experience. So using games align very well with what Kolb suggested in their paper on a experiential learning. Of course, this also means that the game must tell the story of the reality if we want to teach something through a game, so that the players or students in this case can connect the game elements to the actors in the real world, to actions that they would carry out to reflect on the relationship between game victory conditions and how these victory conditions could look like in the world outside the game, so the world that exists outside of the game. I also quite like the way that Combe in 2021 described the what he calls laws of learning. So that's from a paper specifically focusing on military education, but it's also a bit broader on how not only war games but different kinds of games could help participants to learn. So the first law, and this again comes from different sources, so synthesizing the different sources in literature that Combe does, is the first law is the law of readiness, which is games create this feeling of flow, where external stimulators, including mobile phones, become less attractive. So they involve a player because they have to make actual decisions and get feedback from them. So they create that loop where the player is in, okay, so if I do this, what kind of result do I get? If I do that, what kind of result do I get? How to get back at my friend who did something that destroyed all my plans or something like that. So it helps the students and the participants to distract themselves from all of the other tempting activities that could be happening outside. And well, yeah, you just have this flow within the game. And that's really something that's noticeable with the students. If, for example, after an hour and a half lecture, we switch to a seminar where we play a game. The second law that outlines is the law of exercise, which relates to the skills that the students have and using them to make decisions. So that's one key important elements that games have that other models, as we'll see, do not necessarily have, is making a decision that has an impact and provides you feedback. And for this, students ideally will have had already learned some skills, gained some knowledge during the class that they could try and apply and to see how it works and if it works. So it works as an exercise of skills and knowledge that students already have had covered in the earlier parts of the class. The third law is the law of effect, is that usually the game creates this positive emotions and which increases the effect that the learning has. If you are engaged in an activity that makes you look good, or at least have you stronger emotion, it's more likely that you will learn from it. Now, this of course can lead to some questions on what happens when the player is losing the game. That definitely can bring negative experience. So depending on the game and depending on participants, it's sometimes smart to end the game early without there being a huge difference between the winning and the losing players, so that everyone still gets these positive emotions out of it, and that all of them can still feel, we're a part of the game, we can still do something and we can still achieve something. The fourth law is the law of intensity. So again, this focusing that games require intense focus and intense involvement, and where you are more intensely invested, the better you learn. The fifth law, the law of primacy, is that the game necessarily, as any kind of model of reality, has to make some shortcuts. We cannot include everything that is relevant for a specific topic in a game, as we can't in any model. If you take a map of the world as a sort of model of our physical reality, geographic reality, then having a model that's a map, that's on a scale of 1 to 1 is very much useless because it's just so large that it tells you nothing. So games have to be working, and the players must be able to engage them. So they necessarily limit which aspects of reality they include and which they cut out. So using a game and interpreting it as a model can help stress some of these aspects of the reality, even if not focusing on others. So it can help you to bring forward lessons that you want to teach. Of course, it relates to game selection, and I saw in the chat earlier that there have already been considerations on how to find games that would be relevant. And so the final law is that law of recency, that newly learned information is better remembered. And what games do is, even within a single session, you have a feedback loop. So each round you do something, you get feedback. And the more you do that, the more you remember of what happens in the game and how it works, and the longer it sticks. And I still have students, as well as my colleagues, who used to run some simulations or so from earlier years, who still remember quite well some of the lessons from the games, or they played in the during well, some years ago, or even, even if not the actual lessons in terms of content, that we played the game, we get something out of. Okay, now moving on to this third part on playing and designing games. So I mentioned several times today about the interpretation of games as models. And what I think here is important, to maybe also give as an example is I teach game theory, and the students that I use games with usually have had already at least some experience, hands-on experience with game theory. So just to quickly bring everyone on the same page. So a game theory, as I mentioned at the start, is a branch of mathematics that helps define strategic situations and identify the strategies of different players. And one of the more famous examples from the Cold War period is the Prisoner's Dilemma, where the story goes of the game that two persons are caught by police, and they are accused of a crime, but the police doesn't have really any evidence that they, for example, robbed a bank. And so they separate the two individuals and then gives them this dilemma. So you can either speak and admit guilt, or you can stay silent. Now, if both players stay silent, they less get, say, 1 year punishment or so. So because the police doesn't have enough evidence, so they get charged for something less. On the other hand, if both of them speak, then basically both of them implicate one another, and so on. So the game is set in such a way that individually, for each player, it's better to speak, while even if it leads to worse outcomes for both of the players. And mathematically, there are solutions to the game equilibrium and so on, and we cover that with students. But using similar models as games, where you actually say, okay, now you're player A and you're player B, and these are the actions that you can do, and these are the outcomes that you can get, asks players not only to find the solution, but also to think through the full logic. So I started doing this in my game theory classes, especially the earlier ones, is that, okay, let's play out the games. Let's play out these situations that we normally solve mathematically. Let's play them out in the classroom, divided them students into peers or groups. And, you have these limited actions, you have these limited knowledge of the payoffs, and now you select your actions simultaneously so that the other player doesn't know what you're doing. So what this brings to the class is that instead of just finding a solution, you ask to make them to make a decision. And now, very often, these decisions that are made are, deviate from this perfect mathematical solution, and that's going to lead to a totally new discussion, open up a new space for discussion. Why do we get different results in the class when we actually play the game rather than when we solve it mathematically? So this means players need to engage with the element of the model. You can repeat the game and see how the results change over time. You can introduce uncertainty, randomness, and so on. So even in the classes that have this clear focus on already having tools such as maths to solve the models, you can make them playable, and that can increase participant engagement. And that leads us back to the sculpt model. So you have concrete experience of the situation. You have to reflect on what you are going to do, what your opponent or a companion is going to do. What do you expect? How do you expect them to behave? So sort of abstract conceptualization of the rules, and then actively experiment with it. Okay, so this round I take this action, this round I'll take another action, get concrete experience through the results again. So this is, just a basic connection between games and models, and where games can work as models, but of course we can be more complex, and both commercial and freely available options are out there, and they can be used as games in the class to illustrate specific concepts. So let me now cover a couple of examples of what we play and why we play it. So one of the games is Root. We usually play it outside of the classroom, so because it can take longer, and so we organize some extra class activities depending on the schedule. Like we'll have one on Monday. So the Root has this fictional theme about different types of animals living in the forest, in the woodlands, and trying to get basically control of the woodland. So it's a sort of a war game in disguise in that sense, or maybe not even so much of a disguise. But what is interesting about it is it's very asymmetrical, and each faction is based on some kind of political, economic structure. So for example, you see on the picture up there, you see a cat watching the crows. So cats are very much industry or military industrial, so to say, complex, trying to extract resources to build military to defense resource extraction and so on. Then you have crows or corvids that are basically just, like a criminal gang, trying to, what's the English word, trying to carry out their activities through kidnapping, bribing, bombing, and all of the other activities that that criminal gangs would be engaged in, and that can lead to interesting discussions. So first of all, of course, what does symmetry mean and so on, but also can we think, or can students then think, that would be the question to them, of course, of the counterparts in the real world of these cute factions that they're playing. Well, cute likely, and quote unquote, knowing what they do within the game. For example, the cats start controlling nearly whole of the woodland, so they're the hegemon initially until the other faction starts rising. And when they weaken, what happens is that others take place. So, for example, like the corvids, the criminal gang, or organized crimes, starts controlling parts of the woodland. And if you look, there is research literature focusing on exactly that. So what happens if the government's control over the country or parts of the country diminishes? Then there is room, or it at least cannot provide full security for the citizens. Then criminal gangs can find space to start acting as an alternative to that government. So depending again on the lesson, Root is a very good sort of a sandboxy game in that sense, that you can have different factions. I believe there are now about 12 or so of them, where you could have different combinations, tell different stories, and you can start asking questions. Okay, so what does this story tell, and how these interactions would work in the real world? I see a couple of comments here that Root is simultaneously super cute and horrifying, which is true. And authors being capitalists, yeah, the authors are these sort of mercenary faction, and the capital faction, yeah, this trading East India vibes a little bit, maybe East India Company vibes. And arms dealers, yeah, that's also a good example of what's behind the authors. Role-playing games, well, of course, it's a bit different than role-playing games, other than board games with the closed rule structure, can also be interesting and very usable. So we used a game of Dog Eat Dog by Lam Liwanag Burke on colonialism. And basically, this is a role-playing game that doesn't require any game master to run, but players themselves act throughout the game, where in a way that drives the story further, where one player basically takes the role of this colonial power and the others play the natives. And the game focuses on the introduction of rules and institutions. So how do the natives, players representing the natives in this case, start setting up rules that limit their own behavior? So there are, of course, rules for that. We don't have to go deep into this because we don't have a lot of time for it. But it again leads to interesting questions. So where does power come from? And how do self-enforcing institutions emerge in a society? And in this case, as it's a role-playing game that requires no game masters, of course, in addition, a good thing to run in the class, because you have larger class, you don't need to GM each of the groups that you have playing, but rather just oversee that the rules are clear and so on. Now, for other games, so since I mentioned my core students come from political science and economics, this year I'm planning to run a John Company game for them, which is focused on the British East India Company, its rise and fall, and it can bring interesting discussions based to the already relating to the experience that students bring from the other courses. So, for example, the game is about up to six families controlling the British East India Company, and they're sort of working together, but in the end, it's only one who wins through having the best reputation from all of the shareholders in the company, and that can lead to questions that are questions that are very sort of modern and very relevant today. What's the link between focusing on just maximizing value for shareholders and existence of their company? What's about the effects of negative externalities or the negative effects of the India that the company is looting at the same time, and what incentives does this create for players? And I think that's where one of the strengths of board games lies, and their application in class is if a game clearly gives a role to the player. So what real world actor I represent, even if it's something not an individual but the family or the government, it helps to connect the structure of the game, the rules of the game, and the mechanics that are being used to the real world counterparts. So, for example, how the family incentives to just make sure that your retired family members live very well and are very well off, so that you have a high respect in the society, can link to negative effects for the population of India. It also includes some politics with one family, controlling the prime minister and so on. So it can relate to many of the subjects that the students already have had that can lead to an interesting discussion afterwards. I haven't run it last year, but I'm planning to do it this year and sort of have done a plan for it. Another game that, again, to give you as an example, is The British Way by Stephen Rangazis, released by GMT, is about the British Empire and the four scenarios, which are the Palestine, Malaya, Kenya, and Cyprus, which models the counterinsurgency, so government against insurgent factions, with asymmetries, providing the story of how the events unfolded, and importantly, connecting real-world dynamics to game mechanics. And that's where a discussion about this connection, so what happened in the actual case, and what happens in the mechanics and within the game, and how that you connect can help understand the overall functioning of the model behind the game better. For example, last year, I believe, I've had this class on a couple of classes with the military academy cadets, where they have already had covered case studies of Ebola in Africa, and then I introduced a game that models controlling Ebola in Africa. So they could already connect their case study knowledge to the to the game, and that increased involvement, understanding of what the game tells, of the strategies that they can use, etc. So we'll see how it worked with the British way this year as well, by having to some pre-read texts on the topic and then trying to see how it plays out, and especially how the 4 different scenarios differ. So you have the same situation, you have a British Empire against a particular insurgent, but 4 different stories with different elements mechanically. So it will be an interesting exploration of that. It doesn't all have to be mechanical, commercial. So an example is Turning the Tides, a game by Bessie Jocelyn, developed and released as a print and play through Georgetown University Wargaming Society, which is a game on climate change. And it's a simple, not a simple, but simple in the sense that it's a print and play game that you can get off the internet. Here's a link also at in the slide, which lays out very core challenges to fighting climate change through the perspective of varying interests of different actors. So there are 3 players in the game representing the US, the European Union, and China. Each has their own interests in relation to economy or government popularity or reduction of the greenhouse gases. Everybody can lose. So if you see the red zone here in the picture, so if by a specific point in time, if all the greenhouse gases emissions are still up there, then everybody can lose. But otherwise, each player has different incentives, which may not necessarily lead to collectively positive outcomes. Here. So what I want to say by this is that very often there's a possibility to find print and play games that could help engage the class. And importantly, these games are quite often rather short and they don't have too many rules. So they may also be easier to introduce, especially if you're starting the course, the students are not yet playing a lot of games, or because very likely that experience of games varies within a group. Bringing these games and using these games, can help make sure that everyone is a bit more experienced or exposed to how games worked in general before moving on to more complex and complicated games. And finally, the final point that I wanted to discuss is about these working of development, working on game prototypes as a course outcome. So in one of the courses I have, we use basically nearly all of the grade relates to, in one way or another, to use student prototypes that they have to develop during 3 or 4 months. And here what we have is that it can help improve several skills that will be relevant for future studies also. So first of all, what I usually do is allow them to select a theme. So on a topic that is interesting to them. That's one thing, because it increases engagement. Maybe they have done some work already on the topic for another class or whatever. If it's interesting to them, then it's more likely that they will already know something about the topic, and that where you will see more engagements. And these topics can vary. This year, students picked topics ranging from gerrymandering before the election to medieval siege logistics and so on. So if it worked for them, it works for me. Of course, it also means that the lecturer also has to do some more reading to catch up on these topics, but that's also a good thing. So the next step is doing research. So because these games must have a basis in reality, at least to the current knowledge. So it's important the students do a literature review, and that they can select what's important for their own model on which they can base their games. And that it forms a quite large part of the work, doing proper literature review, synthesizing it, and saying, okay, this is how my model looks like, because that's how that's what the literature says. In the end, what they have also to provide, in addition to just rules and the physical components, is a designer notes where they describe how their rule set, how their game relates to the literature that they reviewed. So how actual dynamics are reflected in the mechanics of the game. Yeah, so then selection of focus and developing a model, and then transforming into a game. This is, of course, the most challenging part. As you know, it's always new to them. At least they haven't had students who developed their games before. But it's also an exercise in playtesting. So I try to ask students, playtest as soon as possible, playtest a lot, change things, delete things that are not working, add things that might work, and so on. And which is also a social activity, because everybody gets to interact with one another's prototypes, give feedback, take feedback, learn to understand feedback, and so on. So these are also sort of soft skills that might be handy in the future. And finally, of course, using the game to teach others to present the final outcome. So game prototyping is as a course task can also be cover quite a lot of field in terms of how to do research, even if the end result is not the research paper, but instead a game. And yeah, so that's it from me. Thanks a lot for listening and for the comments, and I'm gladly take any questions you have.
Great, thank you. So we do have two questions, fairly similar. Carl in the main chat has the question, with more direct real-world simulation games, do you find students/players do not like some of what the games are asking them to do? He says he's heard John Company can be off-putting if players deeply engage with the theme and emphasize with the situations. And then Liz has a somewhat similar but slightly different question. Because so many game publishers are based in Europe and America, I see a lot of colonialism/white nationalism in the stories about world history. It's clear you're addressing these topics as well in your classes. How do you judge games for their criticism of colonial institutions?
Okay, thank you, George, and thanks, Carl and Liz. Those are very linked and very good questions. So in terms of general engagement with the topics of the real world that where games may ask players to do or incentivize players to do something that they wouldn't want to be doing, or it can be provocative, such as in the case of John Company, which is very much a game giving incentives of a greedy, self-focused family that doesn't really care about the outcomes for the broader society. What usually do is you sort of explain what the game is about and what actions it may require. So for these games, I also tend to maybe keep them for these extra class activities, which are also not compulsory or not obligatory. So we organize them from time to time, and those who want, those who joined. At the same time, I must admit, I have had not experience yet, but I've been teaching this particular course for several years only, and for very small groups, a student who was very much off-put by a specific game or so. Instead, I think what we usually get is a discussion of what it tells, or why the incentives are there, and what kind of perspective the game provides, and whether the game itself, sets up as a perspective that the designer wants to say, okay, this is a perspective that should be taken, or that's a critical perspective that's there. Like in this other game by the designer of John Company, in an infamous Traffic about opium wars, the outcome that you can get is the top hat, I think. It's sort of it's also a critique of this. But yeah, I see the point, and we usually try to discuss this with students and what the perspective a game provides and why it has this this particular perspective. And for these games, engagement outside of the class can also be, something where that players are okay with engaging with that specific topic from that perspective. Coming back to Liz's question on judging the games for the criticism of colonial institutions is, again, we do discuss them in advance quite often, of what the game tells the story about. Like for the British way, I'll post some pre-reads, the rule books are also available to give a bit of a context of what the game is about and what the game tells, and how it provides different perspectives, and whether it's a criticism of colonial institutions or it's not. And we usually, we do stick with the games that are criticism, that include criticism, rather than, as I see in the chat currently, the discussion of Puerto Rico and the colonists there. So we focus on these games that look at the criticism, and then we try to discuss and engage the criticism either pre-play itself or the post-play, and of course during the play. And I think it can also be resonating again, as I started at the beginning of the webinar today. Now we ourselves regained independence in the 90s, so we know also have sort of this first-hand experience, at least our parents have, and our grandparents have this first-hand experience with the occupation and this may connect in different ways with students. So yeah, I think it's what's important is to come in open-handed, so to set the expectations clear and what's happening there. So I think talking and discussing is very important, but then so is a selection of games. So I wouldn't focus on I wouldn't include Puerto Rico, but I'd rather focus on games that also criticize the institutions. Like, for example, this role-playing game, Doggy Dog, which I mentioned. It's very much about colonialism and where one player has to play that role of the colonial power, but it's also about explaining the process of how these rules can become enforced within the colonized society. I hope this at least to an extent answers the questions, and I'm happy to answer anything else.
Thank you. So if there are any more questions, feel free to put those in the chat. Also, for any of you needing an LEU certificate, I did put the request form link in the chat, so feel free to fill that out, and I'll get your certificate out to you later this week.
I'll also drop my email, so if you have any follow-up questions, you'll find it in the chat. Feel free to write me anytime, and I'll try to do my best to respond and help out if I can. I also see some earlier comments in the chat that one of the games reminded of the Settlers of Catan, which was an inspiration for that particular student game, although they switched the topic to resource extraction, but there was certainly an element to that.
Great. All right. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions, although we'll happily stick around for a few more minutes. But if you don't have questions and your day is full, feel free to leave us. I think we're winding down. I want to thank Dr. Krūminas. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. The recording of this and your certificates will be out as soon as I get them all packaged up and ready. And have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for joining and the questions. And thanks, George, for having me here. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you.